Happy New Year, everyone! Here we are again. We are back for the roundup. This time, it's not a weekly roundup. What we're going to try to do is to try to round up some of the themes that I think, or we think, will be important for the year of 2023. So, of course, as always, got Ralph Hebgen here for you in the studio. In the London studio, right? And so anyway, so we're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to be talking about automation, energy, supply chains, big tech regulation, and ESG. And at the end, Ralph has an extra present for you as well, in the form of predictions. But anyway, so let's kick off. So these are some of the themes that we think are going to be important for this year. So firstly, automation. I'll just quickly sort of summarize the initial sort of thing on that. So with regard to automation, I think it's been fair to say that over the course of the coronavirus and the subsequent war in Ukraine, automation has become much more of a topic of conversation than it has been before. Of course, everyone knows about going to factories, like car manufacturing, or if you go to a warehouse like Ocado or Amazon, a lot of these processes are actually automated. However, I think that what has happened, certainly in coronavirus, is that we've discovered that, say, in certain industries in manufacturing where it is very people intensive, that actually that has become a weakness. So, for instance, meat processing in the US, for instance, that got really weak. And the other thing as well is maybe agriculture, especially say in the UK. I mean, I think a lot of that is to do with Brexit because you can't get the workers in. But again, I think that the onus, and then subsequent to that, we've had the war, and that has suddenly meant that we've realised, again, this is more of an agriculture thing, but how much we get from certain places, and then how that impacts on our own agricultural capabilities. But anyway, the main thing here is I think that the sense of urgency for automation has intensified, because the idea is potentially maybe increased automation means you don't need so many people. It doesn't matter so much if there is like a health crisis or something, because manufacturing, etc., will continue. But what do you think, Ralph?
Well, absolutely. I think these are very interesting points. I mean, automation, of course, as we all know, has always been a trend, has always been a potent factor in the process of manufacturing ever since the Industrial Revolution. And we've seen this continuing, but now I think we are seeing this already accelerating. And the reason why it is accelerating is because our technological capabilities are improving. And it is in particular, I think, the blend between AI and robotics which are going to generate new machinery that is going to be used in an arena where previously automation was unthinkable. For example, surgical theaters, surgical operations, but of course also things like crop picking. I mean, people might be surprised that I put surgical operations, crop picking into one basket, but in terms of human activity, robots are very poor in replicating the dexterity of a human being, and picking a crop is actually quite a difficult sort of task to do for a robot who would typically crunch a tomato to pulp rather than picking it off the tree. If tomatoes grow on trees.
I tell you what, I'd be very impressed to see your tomato tree next time I see you. But
yeah, as you guys know, I'm a city boy. I don't really know where anything comes from. But anyway, cool. So moving on. So I believe that is a technological trend, which of course has already been highlighted by the last 5 years of development and will accelerate. Now, the things which you mentioned, I think, add a new dimension of motivation to this, because there's always been the classical motivation of industries to increase their efficiency through automation. But I believe the COVID crisis has indeed highlighted the fact that, sorry for the way in which I'm going to phrase this now, which is going to sound a bit callous, but it has highlighted that humans in the process, in a manufacturing process, are vulnerable components because they're vulnerable to disease. And if we have automated machines which do these processes, then that, of course, will be less of a risk.
Yep.
Now, this is always embedded in a social process, of course, as well. Automation may be a long-term positive for a society as a whole, but it is certainly short-term existentially threatening for those who are being let go. And in a culture such as the UK and other industrialized cultures, you always have trade unions who are going to act against this trend. And so we have two dynamics here. One is a heightened and accelerated trend of automation, accelerated by an additional urge to implement it, as you said, and that will be counteracted by the trade unions who are going to be more of a force against this. But I think over, pick a year, pick a time period, 10 years, over the next 10 years, we are going to see, I think, this process net accelerating.
Absolutely. And actually, you know, I mean, I would have thought that ultimately, so I think while we're on this journey, that actually the unions will be more keen on you know, getting involved, protecting workers, workers' jobs, etc. But ultimately, the more, I'd say, the irony is, the more they do it, the more they give the sort of employers the impetus to actually get rid of people. And, you know, ultimately, you know, if you don't have any workers, you won't have any union problems. So, I mean, I know that's very controversial and not a very nice way of saying it, but, you know, bluntly, that's basically what it is. So, so yeah, you know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I, you know, when we were talking about this earlier, you know, again, we both said that you would have thought if self-driving cars, self-driving lorries and things are becoming a sort of reality fairly soon, you would have thought, although I don't know, but you would have thought that rail would be more possible, because you go along a rail track. You can't go anywhere else. I mean, I guess it's a question of speed and making sure that the train reads the signals properly. So,
yes, quite. I mean, these are the technological issues that have to be resolved. But I think, I just want to leave it at that. But obviously, your point on the trade unions, less human beings are involved in the process, less human beings are there to be sacked. That's I don't know, perhaps, but this is going to be a different discussion, because it increases the bar, which defines the difference between skilled and unskilled workers. The more automation, the more the higher the bar is below which you are being classed as unclassified, as unskilled. You think about it, the radiologists, for example, or these are the surgeons, radiographers who read and interpret the results of a radiography. They can be replaced by AI, and this is of course a qualified, skilled job. Anyway, that's too much of a topic for today, I believe, but yes, so I'll leave it at that. I would agree that in the next 10 years we're going to see an increased, accelerated process of automation in the form of a blend between AI and robotics.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so let's go on to the next subject, which is energy. So I think that most people would probably agree that energy has become somewhat of a hot topic over the course of 2022. Now, I think that prior to the Ukraine war, I think that it would be fair to say that renewables were already not looking particularly great in terms of performance because of the lack of wind. And therefore, the price of energy was already going up before we actually ended up going in, before Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, the thing is, on that front, what we have now seen is we have seen that. I mean, I thought it was interesting how, Germany in particular, well, but I think, to be fair, most countries, but Germany in particular, was very much a case of, very much a convert to renewables, because Angela Merkel had in the past been very pro-nuclear, right? But then obviously Fukushima happened, then she did an about turn and was very much on renewables. So everyone was on the track of renewables. I thought it was very interesting that then, this started to change. We saw Macron sort of saying, well, actually, maybe we should, in France, saying maybe we should do more nuclear, etc. But anyway, the Ukraine thing happened. The gas was essentially gas supplies were cut off to vast tracts of Europe, and in the intervening period, we have seen a general scrambling for old kind of fossil dirty fuels, gas for coal fired, for keeping nuclear power stations open for longer than they were supposed to be, all these kinds of things. And I think that we are going to see an accelerated sort of rollout of more of a wider variety of different energy generating sources, because people have realized that if you just rely on gas that comes through from Russia, then you're going to be in a bit of trouble. So what do you think, Ralph?
Well, again, absolutely. We've discussed it before. I think the Ukraine war, the invasion of the Ukraine, is highlighting precisely that the free world economies have become too dependent on cheap gas and cheap gas from Russia and cheap oil a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And obviously now we have got the political will to emancipate our economies from this. And unfortunately, short term, this is going in the wrong direction when we throw global warming into the mix, and we are thinking about extending the life of coal-fired factories. Power plants, which is a problem, but also highlights how much we need to scramble in order to accomplish this level of emancipation and self-determination in terms of our energy politics. Yes, absolutely. The nuclear, the swerve away from nuclear power is particularly visible in Germany, but I think it has also been similar in other countries. And I think short-term indeed, the short-term decision indeed has to be to refocus on nuclear energy as an energy which is sustainable in the harnessing of it, whereas renewable energy such as wind and solar do depend on the weather and are therefore volatile.
Do you mean the whether or not they're going to supply enough electricity? Sorry,
you're just so switched on. I mean, nothing gets past you. And the issue then becomes, of course, as we have said before, we can't actually do this within a week, and it's possibly going to take 10 years to actually get the capacity for nuclear power generation back up to scratch. But I think the decision has been made that this is going to be important, and that is going to happen. Second point, which I would like to make, is longer term still, but we are talking about trends. So this is the right framework into which to embed such a comment, and that is again nuclear fusion. We've seen a recent breakthrough has been proof of concept that it is possible, and I think this is going to mean that more private money investment is now going to be fueled, is going to be directed. Yeah, okay, fine, I know. Is going to be directed into this field. And so again, in terms of a trend, I think we're going to see more investment into nuclear, both fission, this is the old style nuclear power, and fusion, which is going to be, I think, the longer term future.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And we are going to see this is going to run and run. I mean, all these themes aren't just fly by night things. These have both long term life, but also I think that there's a lot of urgency to improve or change the situation in the short term as well. And I would add onto the energy point, I would add the fact that I think that there's, again, more urgency to not only improve the generation, because, I mean, if you've got, a lot of volatility, say at a lower level like this, one way of generating enough electricity is to have more of it. So therefore, although it will be still volatile, it will be volatile, but with a higher level. I'm saying this because not everyone's going to be watching this, right?
Yeah,
so they won't see my finger moving up and down. So I'm trying to do this for the benefit of people
who are listening. For those not watching, Peter Watson has spared no expense in a high 3D animated graph. He's basically wiggling his finger in the air erratically.
Yeah.
I suggest we move on to the next topic.
But I think that one of the ways of reducing that is to have more battery storage. So the actual you can hang on to more of the electricity you've actually generated. So again, I think that anything to do with that will see a lot of investment this year. Right. Okay. Next thing, supply chains. Over COVID, I mean, I'm sounding like I'm repeating myself all the time here, but over COVID, and over through this Ukraine war, we have seen a number of weaknesses in terms of supply chains. So something like, I mean, I don't know its exact thing, but it's something like 80% of the world's rubber gloves came from Malaysia or Indonesia. I think it was Malaysia, but anyway, the main point being very, very concentrated. Most of the world's PPE came from China. Those kinds of things we've had supply chain problems in terms of shipping capacity, which has been huge, like boom years the last few years, but is now starting to slow down. And actually, what the sum total of all this has meant that I think that countries and industries have realized that in fact they are relying too heavily on one source or a few sources, and therefore they need to try to diversify this. And in order to do that, they need to become more self-sufficient. And in becoming more self-sufficient, you would argue that necessitates deglobalization. But what do you think, Ralph?
Well, this is actually a very interesting topic in the context of trends. I can talk about it as follows, I think. I mean, first of all, globalization is essentially a trend which recognizes that labor costs are very high in the industrialized nations, and so basically outsource manufacturing capacity to those parts of the world where labor costs are still low. And everybody in theory wins, because the industry capacity which is building in those parts of the world where labor costs are low is feeding into the local economies, and labor costs are rising there, and the standard of living of people there increases. In theory, that's the idea. But now, of course, we are seeing possibly a trend away from globalization again, because of the concentration precisely of the supply chain, which you mentioned, has been one negative consequence of this trend. Now, interestingly, we now need to be because of the war in the Ukraine and the potential of China to invade Taiwan has highlighted the geopolitical risks which globalization has entailed. And one way to mitigate this problem is, of course, again, to emancipate ourselves from these, just in a similar way as we emancipate ourselves from energy production in Russia, and funnily enough, insource some of this manufacturing capacity back here. But unfortunately, in the first place, we were outsourcing it because our labor costs are so high. So what are we going to do? And again, this, I think, highlights automation again, because automation will mean that we are going to be able to do this increasingly efficiently. And if anything, these trends will again accelerate more the trends to automation, which we already discussed. On the flip side, it might actually mean that therefore the economies away from the free world, which are still underdeveloped, are going to be less capable of developing their own industry, and might actually become more prone to becoming a political risk as they become more more dominated by the hegemonial forces such as China in the South Asian Sea and others. But that's possibly a trend too far. So I would believe that, yes, short term, this is going to lend to deglobalization and accelerate automation back at home.
Awesome. Right, so moving on to the next one. So big tech regulation. On that front, I think it would be fair to say over the course of 2022, and certainly it feels like going into the last half of 2022, we've seen an increasing momentum of regulators around the world, particularly in the US and the UK, but also actually in Europe from Ireland. We've seen a lot of wins for regulators against big tech. Now, I think this is very interesting because it doesn't seem to be that long ago where we saw Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, and all the rest of them hauled up in front of Congress to answer for various questions and criticisms about their power. Now, at that point, I would suggest that they were at the height of their powers, loads of money behind them, share prices were very strong, and they kind of managed to weather it. However, over the last year or so, we've seen a big tech sell-off. We have seen much more weaknesses in these big names. And I think that has meant that the regulators are smelling blood and they feel that they can actually go in and they can actually do something. And I think that this is important because we need to have more protection, I think, for users, for user data, specifically before we even contemplate doing anything more with the metaverse. Because if we can't get 2D right in terms of the internet that we're on at the moment, how are we going to do when things get much more complicated in the metaverse? But what do you think about that, Ralph?
Well, I have actually little to add. I think you analyze the process in the way I would also think about it. It's almost like the regulator is now in a position to force through some a regulatory framework which I must be honest, I believe is sorely needed in order to allow the tech industries to grow and blossom into the next phase. So in a way, I wouldn't really, well, I don't know what I can expect from the tech industries, but I would hope that they realize that in the end, a responsible regulation of the industries is going to be in their own interests. I mean, if we remember the Facebook scandals in connection with the Cambridge Analytics situation, has surely taken some of the luster away from Facebook in the way also for investors. And we were going to talk about this, of course, as well in just a second. ESG, sort of the wider framework of ethical investment, would identify some of the tech companies as uninvestable. And so if it is properly regulated, people can have more confidence that they're investing in a sector which is not nefarious or driven by nefarious hidden agenda, and that would eventually be, I think, in the interest of the tech sector. Of course, the devil, as always, will lie in the detail. We'll have to see what regulation is going to come, in which way it is going to be implemented, whether it's going to be impede or choke off the growth potential of these industries. But yes, so I think in general, responsible regulation is always something which I think aids the development of an industry rather than jeopardizes it.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, moving on to the last one before your fantastic free gifts at the end, is ESG. So ESG, I think that we again, here we go again, with regard to coronavirus, and then the Ukraine war. What we have seen is that that, for instance, and especially the war really, but for instance, sectors like pharmaceuticals, like oil, and defence have been avoided in many cases by ESG funds, because maybe for pharmaceuticals, maybe because of the way that they test their products or something, or the way that they use chemicals, etc. with oil. They're saying, well, you don't want to invest in oil because you're digging it out of the ground. That's harming the planet. And with defence, they're saying, well, we're not going to invest in defence companies because you kill people. But on the other hand, you have got pharmaceuticals companies which make vaccines in record time. You've got oil companies which are basically powering what we've got at the moment, and then you've got defence companies who also protect people as well. Mm-hmm. So all of these things have added up, and we found that. I think that ESG has caught everyone with their pants down, etc. on that front. And I think that we saw towards the end of the year with DWS, which is the investment arm of Deutsche Bank, getting accused of greenwashing. And I think that the trend this year is going to be a bit of a reset of ESG, probably more guidance as to how it should actually be. And maybe rules change and say what it is and what it isn't, rather than maybe being, I would like to think, less ambiguous. But anyway, that's what I think at the moment. What do you reckon, Ralph?
Well, ESG is a very difficult thing because, I mean, it's of course the wider umbrella of something which we had in the 90s, where these things were called ethical funds. And the problem with it is, I think, in essence, that you have an unquantifiable property, which is ethics, but you need to somehow quantify it. Because if you don't, then of course you don't know what you're talking about. I cannot create an ethical fund or an ESG fund if I don't have criteria which govern the stocks which I can put into that fund, the stocks which I need to select. And so therefore we now have lots of metrics and lots of definitions that identify and define what it means to be a stock in accordance with ESG. And that is, in essence, not bad. The problem is that these definitions are, to a large extent, subjective. And the definitions themselves exist in a framework that impacts on them. So that sounds very general, but I'm basically just describing a general case of an example which you gave. Now, is it ethical to invest in a company that makes arms? Well, no, you would think it isn't, because this is, of course, terrible, because they kill people. And this is, I mean, but there's no benchmark against which killing people can be ethical. Unless you defend yourself against an evil aggressor. And this is, of course, exactly the problem. I'm not saying who is right here. I'm just highlighting the difficulty of the problem of deciding what constitutes ethical fiber and what doesn't. In a world where there is always peace, manufacturing a gun will not be an ethical thing to do. In a world where you may have to defend yourself against an attacker who threatens to destroy your way of life, such an ability to defend yourself will be ethical. And so that is why an investment in ESG is always a difficult thing. So I still applaud that it exists, because I think ethical investment is important. I just think that we need to be very analytical and responsible, I think is the better word, responsible in the way in which we define what constitutes ethical fiber at any one moment in time, and then not be too dogmatic on what actually does. In the end, by the way, investors will be driven by the expectations of returns, and so there are two elements here. One is ethical fiber in whichever way defined, and the other axis of the grid into which you slot these companies is going to be returned. So wide topic, but that's what I would say for now.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's move on to your predictions.
Okay, cool. My predictions are not my own, which is why they may be true. I just wanted to leave you with a quick rundown of polls which have been done by economists of what the major economic metrics are going to be and are going to pan out this year. So we're talking about trends. Now I'm talking about 2023, and this is just going to be me reading it out. So sorry for my eyes are going to point away from the screen. I know this is unprofessional, but there you go. You can complain to Peter Watson about this.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So inflation is going to be expected to pan down to about 3 to 6%, down from headline 12% now. So that is actually good news. Interest rates, people are still expecting interest rates to increase from 3.5% now to something like 4 to 5% at the end of the year. House prices are expected to come down, but only by about 4%. Interestingly, this is my own comment. I have seen that mortgage providers are reducing their fixed rate mortgage rates, and this is because, interestingly, house prices come down, so there's less demand, and mortgage providers are cutting their rates, which is of course positive. Also in the impact of inflation, and probably a reason why economists are expecting inflation to come down visibly this year. The Fed and the ECB are still expected to institute 2 or 3 rate rises this year. Energy prices are going to come down by something like 10%, which is very good and a direct consequence of the trends which we were discussing. People are emancipating themselves from Russia, and this is already taking a positive impact. US-China trade war, will it accelerate or not? Now, this actually surprised me. 97% of economists say no. That is amazing. I will just leave that with you and not comment on it anymore. UK GDP, well, people expect 0 to minus 2%, so 0 to contraction of 2% versus global growth of between 1 to 2%. The UK is in fact expected to be an economy which does worse than basically everybody else. And the reason for that is that following the pandemic, we are now moving into a world where most economies are recovering. The UK is held back because the impacts of Brexit are now making themselves felt, and that is the reason why we're seeing this prediction for the UK. And that is it. Most of it, by the way, is actually quite positive. There are, of course, negatives in this, clear, but I want to just share that with you. The world is, maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe the light is getting a little bit more bright.
Brilliant. No, that's really great. Thank you very much, Ralph. And, thank you for everything, all your thoughts. Always very interesting. Just to say to everyone, Ralph and I are obviously going to be doing, the weekly again, but we are going to be doing a few more other things, which I think that you'll be finding very useful. So please watch out for those as well. But anyway, thank you very much indeed.
Excellent.
Always great to talk to you. Have a great day, whatever you're up to.
And you too. And thanks, guys, for listening. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.